Thank you. And thank you also for the invitation to speak today. My work is mainly about crops, different types of agricultural land use in a wider sense. I also worked a bit on pasture on the side and semi-natural land. And I'm trying to include albedo change and carbon stocks in life cycle assessment. I can also say as a disclaimer that I don't take life cycle assessment methodology as strictly as some standards do at my department. And there it is. At my department, we actually work with life cycle assessments in a quite flexible way. We use the framework, we use the life cycle perspective, but we think that there are large opportunities for developing metrics and using metrics in a more flexible way in order to learn more about the environmental impact of systems. For today, I prepared 3 major points. First of all, the agricultural perspective on albedo, how decisions about land use and management can affect albedo and how large these changes potentially are. The life cycle perspective, so how we model systems, which types of impacts we include, and I will speak only about climate today, although life cycle assessment methodology might also include other types of impacts, such as on eutrophication or acidification. And I will also speak about different types of climate metrics, and I'm really happy that Ryan covered many of the global warming potential issues before, so I can go directly to one proposed solution. And finally, I have done albedo measurements myself and used different types of data, and I will also show you some results on how different types of data can be useful. So to start with, the life cycle perspective on cropping systems usually looks like this. We try in life cycle assessment to gain a system perspective and to include all inputs to the system and emissions in different stages of the life cycle. The main idea behind life cycle assessment is not to suboptimize a part of the product system, such as reducing emissions at one stage if there are more emissions at another stage of the life cycle. So here, for instance, in my studies, I usually include the production of inputs, then a cultivation stage on the field, and there might be some post-processing steps, for instance, if bioenergy is produced or food is produced from the crop. Something that has been developed more recently in life cycle assessments is the inclusion of biological effects during land use. Originally, life cycle assessment was used in an industrial context, and that was not really an issue, but now the cropping systems are increasingly in the focus. It has become more and more important to include changes in soil carbon and also emissions from the nitrogen pool. So here we would include the fact that residues on the field would add some carbon, and some of it will be stored, some of it will be emitted, and the same goes for nitrogen, where you have inputs both from crop residues, but also from mineral fertilizer. On top of that, I include albedo in my studies, and this is the major focus, but I will always try to cover the whole system perspective. Right now, I told you about a system for a single crop, so we could look into production of wheat, for instance. But I think another interesting way of looking at a cultivation system is to look at an entire crop rotation, how different crops affect each other, or which crops are likely in a sequence and provide good conditions for each other. You usually don't grow any crop after another, and some provide better another worse legacy effects in a rotation. And we can also look at perennial crops. The first one here is willow that can be used for bioenergy, but it could also be a perennial ley or a grazing land. So before I start speaking about my research, I wanted to give you a perspective on what life cycle assessment is useful for when it comes to albedo. and other things that I think it is less useful for. I think life cycle assessment is not the perfect framework for process-based modeling. You can do it. There is nobody who restricts the level of detail in any model that you use. So for instance, for soil carbon and nitrogen, you could use a very detailed process-based model. Nothing speaks against it, but it's usually not done and it's not very practical. The reason is because we want to gain an overview in the system understanding, and these levels of details are usually not included. It is often argued that life cycle assessment is used for decision support and that it should inform decisions. And I think that is something life cycle assessment can do very well, but it's usually not used that much in practice as we practitioners think. I think the main strength of life cycle assessment lies really in system understanding which impacts in a cropping system, for instance, are big and which are small. Being able to compare different systems and options or choices. So that in my case would be, for instance, cultivating different crops, different varieties, arranging the crops in a different sequence. An example for this is what we saw previously, that retention of crop residues or having a cover crop can be really useful, but there are also ways to arrange a crop rotation in a new way that the periods of bare soil would be shorter anyway. I will show you some examples later. And then, of course, also in terms of land management, timing of different operations, such as ploughing. You can plough earlier, you can plough later, you can leave residues, you can incorporate them in a shallow manner, you can grow a cover crop, and you can fertilize less or more. And lastly, life cycle assessment is useful to compare different things with a common indicator. And I think here lies also a bit of the problem, and previous speakers have highlighted that carbon dioxide and albedo will never be perfectly comparable. And I think that is something I have accepted, and still I find ways to make comparisons in order to gain understanding about the system. But there are, of course, aspects that are not included. So before we dive into the results, I think we need to gain an overview of how big our operating system for managing the albedo of cropland really is, about which scales, how many percent are we really talking? And when you look at this figure between 0 and 100% albedo, it is a bit discouraging maybe, that the operating space for different crops and other vegetation that is common in agriculture is actually rather small. So I think with different types of crops and varieties, we can change the albedo by 1 to max 8 percentage points or so. And that will likely be not during the entire year, but during the vegetation period, of course. When we go towards the soil part here, you see a bigger range, but I think this is a part where we can actually not do so much. We can, of course, make sure that the soil is covered, but as we heard before, if it rains and the soil is wet, then the albedo will be much lower, and that is also stronger for naturally dark soils than light soils. So it depends a bit on soil type and amount of precipitation, how problematic or how good or bad bare soil is. And then the largest effect comes, of course, from snow cover, but snow cover is usually not so long-lived on croplands. So this snow cover effect, at least in my systems, has never materialized in terms of climate impact. So I think the main question when we try to optimize cropland is, when does the change happen? Is it in winter? It's not so important as if it is in summer due to different amounts of radiation. How long does this change take place? Can we influence it? How big is it? How many percent? And I talk about percentage points. And how robust is this change? The reason for saying how robust is it is because there is a lot of natural variability in albedo of croplands. And I think we have to be careful if we decide that we want to try a measure to increase albedo, but actually it might be different for different places, for instance, due to the background albedo of the soil. Another thing I wanted to remind about is that our visual impression of how bright a surface is, and therefore how high the albedo would be, is a bit tricky. It is not always a perfect indication of how high albedo would be, because albedo happens approximately half in the visible spectrum, and the other half of the energy is in the infrared, and we don't see it. So I will also show you an example where a brighter appearing crop, or actually lower fertilization, and therefore a lighter crop, will have lower albedo, although it looks lighter. I promised to talk about methods to quantify albedo, and here are the 3 that I used. I will directly connect them to the results and the different studies I did, because I think they were useful in different ways. So in my first study, I assessed the climate impact of producing bioenergy from short rotation coppice willow. That is a perennial energy crop that is growing, that is grown in cutting cycles of 3 years, and then for a total period of at least 20 years or longer. So in this case, it was not feasible to measure for so many years, and we decided to use a long-term radiation record from a stationary tower, where the data was actually collected for a different study, and I was lucky to use the radiation data set of reflected and incoming radiation. So there I got a great data set over 3 years. It was continuous every 30 minutes, and I could assess changes over years, because willow is only cut after 3 years. So in the first year it would be really small, and then we thought that the albedo would evolve, and that would be really important. I can say it was not so important actually, because once the willow shrub had grown its leaves, that was already in the first year, there was no big difference anymore. So actually 1 year of data would have been sufficient. And for this type of short, fast growing tree species, I can say that there is no big evolution in albedo after that. But anyway, it was interesting to see variability between years for other reasons, mainly due to weather. Coming to the second study, there we measured albedo on different croplands, actually different field trial plots with a mobile mast. You can see in the picture a tripod where we mounted a pyranometer that is placed 1.5 meters above the canopy, and we increased and decreased the height depending on how the crop grew. That gave us some limitations, and that's why I put here no height limit for the stationary tower, because we realized after a while that it is not feasible to measure on a really high growing crop anymore late in the growing season. But anyway, we did manage to sample many different plots, and that was a really interesting exercise, also because we could look into details of management. We had some plots that were plowed completely, some with residues left. We had some where a cover crop was undersown, and also the different fertilization levels were included in this study. So mainly here we could really assess choices of crop and management, and we could make sure that the sites were comparable because all of them are located closely to each other and the measurements were from the same year. However, we could of course not include any variability between years, and I know by now that that is a big factor. The third study, there we used the MODIS albedo product. So that is a satellite-based product that is available, readily available from 2000 until today. I think it is really useful because it also has global coverage, and if you manage to extract the right pixels where you know what the land cover this pixel represents really is, then it can be very useful. And this is also the study that I want to start with. So we use the MODIS albedo product, and it is a gridded composite product. That means that the satellite observes on different days from different angles, a surface, and then these individual pictures are sort of resampled on a regular grid. That has the result that the footprint of one pixel is not really a square or anything similar, but it is actually, well, it is sort of the floating pictures that are rearranged into this grid. They will produce a certain footprint. And in 2016, this footprint was modeled by a Gaussian function. And I used this in order to characterize the footprint of each satellite pixel in Sweden. And after that, I could match the footprint of each pixel with land cover. And here I used a very useful data set that is actually available for all EU countries. It is the geospatial aid application data set, which is the data that farmers in the entire EU report in order to get agricultural support under the Common Agricultural Policy. And the INSPIRE directive has the aim to publish those data, this geodata, on a European common platform. This platform has been in place for a really long time, but unfortunately, there is not so much data published yet. But I think over time, more and more of these data sets will be available. And using those data, you can identify each field, each cropland, and you would know for every year what has been grown and harvested there. And this data I used in order to match with the satellite footprint. And in the figure below, you can see what it looks like if a pixel is quite pure. I think 100% purity is, I mean, theoretically it's endless anyway. And also over 95% is really unrealistic because that would be approximately 200 hectare. So what I settled for is 80% purity as a minimum, and then some pixels were more and others less pure. But we didn't really see a difference. The patterns in albedo for the same type of crop seemed the same, so it seems okay. But of course, it's a compromise. And in order for a pixel to be pure, there needs to be a lot of the same crop present close to the center point, and then the footprint decreases towards the side. So there, it's not so important anymore. If there is some impurities further away from the centroid. So what we realized by that analysis is that this method is really suitable for major crop types and for major production regions. So here you have a map of Sweden, and you can see that there were many pure pixels in the south where we have a lot of crop production. And this example is actually for the crop where we found most pixels because winter wheat is most prevalent in Sweden. But then it becomes difficult for the northern regions and also for crops that are not grown on such large scale. Here are some results for this for the region 1, which had most pixels. We found 8 land use types where we could extract sufficiently many pixels so that we could study them. And in total, I used 3,400 pixels from 10 years in my analysis. It was really important to have many pixels from every year and for each crop, because you need to fill data gaps. The MODIS product is really great, but especially in higher latitudes, there are quite a lot of data gaps during winter time, and then you would lose the snow effect. We also realized that taking each year per crop is not a really good idea, because usually, especially the spring crops, what happens outside of the growing season is not really related to the crop. So we created sort of an average, a standard period for everything that happens, as you see with the gray part. Everything that happens before the crop is grown was averaged for several crops that would have the same standard season, so it would not affect the crop what is grown before it. This is a way of making it a bit independent of the crop rotation. If I did a study on the crop rotation, then I would include what the typical sequences of crops are, but in this case we were interested in single crops. What we could see from the data is that there are quite big differences in albedo for each crop between years, so quite some annual variability. But interestingly, this variability was consistent across crops. So we saw, for instance, that in 2013, most crops had a higher albedo than usually. So that could be, for instance, due to differences in precipitation, a wet or a dry season, and so on. Here are some results from this study. Since we worked on annual crops, and well, I think quantifying soil carbon for annual crops is problematic. There are methods, but we did not include it in this study. I will show you an example later where we included soil carbon. So for this one, we did a classical life cycle assessment with production of inputs here in gray, field operations, which includes the production use of diesel in orange, and then nitrous oxide emissions from soil in green. And the blue bar is albedo change. And now we need to be really careful about how we interpret these results. I tried to show first how much the absolute impact from each impact type is. So this albedo is in relation to a zero reference. And of course, this reference doesn't exist. So the blue bar is not meaningful. It is just to show what would happen if you do not define a reference. If I define pasture as the reference, then you get a net effect, and that is the effect of albedo change. These are the small crosses. So this is what is a realistic scenario. If you change from pasture to ley, for instance, you would get approximately 0.5 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent cooling per hectare. And then, of course, you need to do the same for nitrous oxide emissions. There is no land use with zero emission. And that's why I'm trying to show first absolute values and then relative, because assessing land use kind of requires to define a reference, but and we also have to be aware of which reference we use, which one makes sense. And I found it really interesting to see in the previous presentations how different reference scenarios were defined. So I think using pasture is one way because it is probably the one land use that is closest to no emission. It doesn't lose and gain a lot. But then that means that the net result for other crops would be a theoretical change from pasture to, for instance, sugar beet, and that might not be desirable for other reasons, such as biodiversity. So under the assumption that pasture is the reference, the results here show that albedo offsets 20 to 30% of the net greenhouse gas emissions for different crops. I also included the albedo values. These are the mean albedos over 10 years for each crop. And I think what is interesting here is that you can clearly see that the albedo of spring crops is lower. And that is, of course, since the soil is not covered outside of the growing season, but it is possible that the farmers did grow something there. It's just a matter of fact with satellite data, you do not know what they exactly did. But on average, I suppose that some farmers left their soil bare and some would have grown ley on it, for instance, also to increase the soil quality. But I can't really tell. Still, the spring crops had lower albedo, and I think that is also because they start growing a bit later in spring. I will show you some figures over time on that later. For the first study with the tower measurement and the perennial energy crop, I have already talked a lot about this willow system. Here we really focused on these temporal effects and the temporal dynamics in the cropping system, because this willow system exists for 50 years. And during 50 years, you have carbon storage in biomass and an increasing soil carbon pool. So here it was really interesting to look at the dynamics over time. And therefore, in the study, we did a time-dependent life cycle assessment. And this is a method that has been developed for bioenergy before, where you record all emissions per year. So for the 50 years of growing, you would record in each year how much carbon storage in soil, how much in biomass, how much nitrous oxide emission, and then also how much albedo change. And we assessed the climate impact of that with a global annual mean surface temperature change. And that is a metric that is based on the IPCC methods, and it is the integration of the radiative forcing per year and a temperature response function. And I think this is somewhere halfway between the classical radiative forcing methods and what Edouard presented. And I would be really interested to discuss how this type of temperature metric differs from the temperature metric that you use. I will skip this slide. It's mainly because Ryan has actually covered this. It's about how the temperature response of albedo is completely different from the temperature response of greenhouse gases. And just quickly as a reminder, here in the A panel, you can see that if you have the same amount of global warming potential from albedo, from methane, from nitrous oxide, and from carbon dioxide, then the temperature effect looks completely different. The one of albedo disappears much faster, but it's very big in the beginning. And their radiative equivalence, that temperature equivalence is somewhere here between 20 and 40 years. And that is a problem that, or well, an issue that has also been found before for short-lived climate forces in general. The result, I realize I need to speed up a little bit. Maybe I can get some extra minutes due to this longer discussion. But anyway, so these are the results from the Willow study. What we can see is that the blue line is the albedo effect. It continued for 50 years, of course. This is where the study period ends. And it was actually a quite substantial share of compared to soil carbon sequestration. However, since the carbon in the soil stays even after the end of the study period, the effect of soil carbon sequestration is, of course, more permanent than the effect of albedo change. And finally, the field measurements. I think the field measurements were really interesting to understand what is happening for different crops. And I'll jump to the results directly. Here you can see what happens if a crop is fertilized or not. The visual indication is what I said before, that the unfertilized trial in the back is brighter. Nevertheless, it had a lower albedo, and that is because leaves with a higher nitrogen concentration would reflect more radiation in the near infrared, and this is something that we cannot see. So here you see the effect in this plot, where the blue line is the fertilized rye in this case, and the orange is the unfertilized trial, and the green line is a bare soil to compare. The effect of spring and winter crops is mainly visible in spring, where winter crops would have a leap start, so to say, and would start growing faster. And the second point here is that the different crops that are included in this panel, the spring and the winter barley, they had different residue management before they were cultivated. So this has nothing to do with the spring and the winter barley itself, but on one field, residues were left, and on the other one, the field was plowed directly. And lastly, broadleaf crops versus cereal is also quite a big difference. You see here in spring, the broadleaf crop, in this case a winter sown rapeseed, had a much higher albedo directly in spring. And in comparison, winter wheat that had also been established before didn't have such good cover yet. Now I have to speed up even more. I think this is interesting when it comes to interpretation, but maybe we can save the bigger points for a later discussion. The main message of this figure is that most of the climate impact happens in very few months. 80% happen between April and August, because that's where the main share of the radiation comes in, whereas very little is happening in winter. And that's why I think we need to focus on the right periods and also the right duration of measures that we use. And I think with that, I can stop and we can take questions. Thank you.